Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Hamley. Up next on Another View, a history lesson about eminent domain, the government's right to forcibly purchase private property for public use. It was a tactic used to destroy black neighborhoods and allow for the expansion of predominantly white colleges and universities in Virginia. Schools like Christopher Newport University, Old Dominion University, and the University of Virginia. Meet the investigative journalists who bring to light the history of the Shoe Lane neighborhood in Newport News, and a professor who puts it all in context. Stay tuned. Another View is next, right after this news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Hamley. I want to start the show today by talking about a very dear friend of mine, a dear friend of WHRO, a colleague who left us this week. Her name is Dori Morrison. And Dori, if you are a member of WHRO, you probably know her. She handled major gifts for the station, but she was just all pro WHRO across the board. She loved the station. She loved her colleagues. She loved working here. And she and I used to talk all the time because she was an avid listener and supporter of Another View. And from the very beginning, Dori was always there with us. She died suddenly this week, and on behalf of the Another View crew, Lisa Godley and Jordan Christie and and others, Dr. Barry Graham and others associated with our show, we want you to know Shane, her husband, and her daughter Claire, how much we loved her, that we send you our sincere condolences, and know that we are keeping you in our thoughts and prayers. So rest in peace, my friend, Dori Morrison. So in the early 1960s, there were about 20 black families living in ranch-style homes in what was known as the Shoe Lane neighborhood. The Johnsons owned much of the land, and the dream and the plan was to sell part of the land to other middle-class African Americans to expand the neighborhood and continue to build generational wealth. But the dream was denied, thanks to racism and eminent domain. Joining us with the story of the Shoe Lane neighborhood and its impact are investigative reporters Brandi Kellam. Hi, Brandi.
Hi.
How you doing?
Great.
And Lewis Hansen. Hi, Lou.
Hi. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. They're with the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO, along with Dr. Johnny Finn. He is Associate Professor of Geography and Chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. Hey, Johnny, how you doing?
How's it going?
It's good, good. Now, you are here as a professor and an expert on eminent domain. You are not here to represent Christopher Newport University.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
That's right. I'm an urban geographer, and I focus on the history of racial segregation and its ongoing impacts in the present day. And I'm really here in that capacity as someone who's focused a lot on the urban history of Hampton Roads. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking for myself and not for my university.
Okay. All right. Just want to make sure that we were clear on that. So, Brandi, I want to start with you. Why do this story? First of all, for those who don't know, you've written a series of articles called Erasing the Black Spot, and it is about the Shoe Lane neighborhood in Newport News. Why did that pique your interest as an investigative reporter?
Well, initially it piqued my interest because of my close relationship to that city. I grew up in this area, And I was looking to come back to the area and do some investigative journalism. And I talked to a couple of people who had said something about this community, but I had never heard of it. And to me, it seemed like something that should have been more widely known. So after having a couple conversations about it, I recognized that there was a huge part of the story that had been not discussed. There was the part that had already been discussed more widely and had been acknowledged by the university and other news outlets. But there was another part of the story, especially the Johnsons and how much they had saved and how much they had, how much history was in that community, right? And the people of the community. And once I realized that, I recognized it was a story that definitely needed to be told.
Okay, so tell us about the Johnsons. What was Shoe Lane neighborhood? What was it about? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so in the 1960s, it was one of the few communities that Black people could live in, nice neighborhoods that Black middle-class people could live in. But it had started somewhere before that, around like the late 1800s. You had these farmers who had just somehow amassed these large pockets of land, like Mr. Johnson's grandfather, who somehow had the smartness to buy 30 acres of land, right? During that time in Virginia, I do think land was a very prominent, it made you feel prominent as a Black person to have this, right? To say that you own something, especially since there were centuries before that where they did not own anything, right? So the Johnsons came into 30 acres of land in this community and more Black people started moving in. And then when it progressed to the 1960s, they wanted to turn it from major farmland into middle-class housing. So you started seeing more houses pop up around the ranch-style houses that you described in your intro. The Johnsons were passing on the land from the grandfather to Mr. Johnson's father, and then Mr. Johnson himself ended up getting a small little piece of the land so he could build his family too. And so he actually still lives there today. He's in his 80s, so he's been living on that land for 60 years.
And he actually built his house.
He did.
Built his home.
He did.
His home
yeah.
And I mean, these folks were pretty progressive. I mean, you found records of them, the land surveys, and they were going to divide the land into lots so that people could build homes. I mean, there was a whole push.
Yeah, there was an actual real plan. They weren't just talking about it. They were really about it. So they had these 30 acres. The Johnson themselves had about 30 acres of land they wanted to subdivide for whatever the pieces they weren't living on and offer that to Black people who were wanting to move to that area of Newport News, because as we know, it was a very popular area for wealth and elitism at that time, and Black people wanted their piece of the pie. So they wanted to divide up these acres of land so that Black people could live and take advantage of the resources in that area. And they had talked to a civil engineer. They actually had another set of land that part of that had already been divided, and people were already moving on to that, and they were planning to divide another piece of that 30 acres before eminent domain came in. And
so, Lou, what happened? There was this university, this 2-year school thing. What was that about?
Yeah, well, the Johnsons did what white property owners were doing at the time in the 50s and 60s as well. Taking property and developing it and making a lot of new suburban homes and also profiting from the land that they once had. There was a push in the late 50s and early 60s to expand colleges and universities, particularly in Virginia. It was the Cold War. It was the space race. It was a national prerogative to have more engineers and scientists. So at this time, Virginia leaders in Richmond said, okay, we want to grow some of our colleges down in Tidewater, right? So Norfolk and an Old Dominion College, that was going to become more than just a satellite to William and Mary. And then in Newport News, Christopher Newport College, a little 2-year school that was originally holding classes in an old schoolhouse, was earmarked for expansion, to bring more educational opportunities to the Hampton Roads area. And
for everybody?
No. It was almost exclusively white. And Christopher Newport didn't admit its first Black student until the mid-'60s, and Old Dominion at the time was also overwhelmingly white. So The city leaders had several places in Newport News that they could have chosen, and Brandi can tell that story. But they chose Shoe Lane, other places over other places that would have been cheaper and easier to build.
So why did they choose Shoe Lane?
Well, as I said earlier, this was a very prominent, wealthy, elite area that was being built in the center of Newport News at the time. So you had the James River Country Club, and that was also an area where you saw a lot of whites. It was whites only at that time. I don't even think they admitted their first Jewish attendant or whatever you member. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, as you can tell, I'm not a member of a country club. I don't know what the members are called, but anyway. So they didn't admit their first member until the 1990s. Which says a lot about that area at the time, right? So in this particular case, they felt threatened by this pocket of middle-class Black people, not the country club itself, but just the whites who were living in that area at the time who wanted to build this sort of white utopia for wealth and elitism. They felt threatened by the Black middle class influence that could have been in this particular area. Because they recognized
there were going to be more Black folks moving in based on what. Okay.
So, right. So, and as Lou said, there were other sites that could have been selected for this particular college, and the city council member, which was members who were also all white at the time, were influenced by that same power that. In fear, essentially, that these other whites in the area where the Blacks were living at the time were also influenced by. And so there was a lot of racial tension, and ultimately the neighbors and the members in the community of Shoe Lane, which was predominantly Black, lost. They lost that battle in city council.
So, Johnny, eminent domain was the tool that they used to take the land. What is that?
Well, eminent domain is actually in the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and it basically gives the government, the federal government, and through Supreme Court litigation, state governments as well, gives the government the right to take private property for the public good if just compensation is paid. And so it's in our founding documents, and you can see how it kind of in the abstract makes sense. As the country grows, it needs to build railroads, it needs to create easements on properties to put utility lines in. Later, it needs to build highways and roads. And so you can kind of, in the abstract, make sense of eminent domain as something that's necessary for a democratic society. On the other hand, what we see in practice is that eminent domain is very, very frequently used at the expense of minority and especially African American communities and populations for the advancement of white society. And so race and racism end up playing a really kind of an important role in how eminent domain is actually exercised. And we see this all over the country and throughout history. So it's not something that is specific to this one case. It is, of course, specific to this one case, but it's not that this one case was kind of unique. This is something that is happening all across the country.
Yeah, I was going to say, because University of Pennsylvania, I think, was one school that
University of Chicago,
So
NYU,
schools across
Columbia.
the country have done this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where did the title Erasing the Black Spot come from?
It actually came from a professor at CNU. He was the former president, Dr. Anthony Santoro. We were interviewing him for this story, and he revealed to us during the interview that the plan was actually to erase this entire community and that it had been referred to as the Black Spot. And that was the plan initially, but because of so much uprising, the city council members listening to the Black residents at the time complaining about their area being selected, they decided to just take the center part of the community. This is what Dr. Santoro told us, that they decided to take the center part of the community and leave whatever houses were on the outskirts there at the time.
So are there people living there now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And one I know that you all talk about, there's a house that is only accessed by the parking lot for the university.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So what I mean, is there a plan for these folks to keep their land, or can eminent domain happen to them again?
That's a great question. So the university right now, its boundaries do include those houses that are remaining. In theory, they could use eminent domain if they wanted to acquire those homes. It would have to be for a public reason, like a parking lot or what have you. But we know that house is literally bordered by a parking lot. You have to go to... Oh.
No. It's just the whole idea of public, and Johnny, I want you to address this.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to have something for the greater good,
That's
right? A parking lot versus somebody's home where they raise their families. Help me understand.
It's hard to understand. I think that, again, in the abstract, it's a little bit easier to understand. Mm-hmm. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of actually effectively forcibly uprooting a family who may have been there for many generations, or a whole community full of families who have been there for many generations, mm-hmm. It becomes a lot harder to kind of do the cold economic benefit cost analysis to kind of weigh the public good of a parking lot or of a building or of a road against the meaning of home to a family and to a community. It's an impossible calculation, I think, right?
Lou, did these people go to City Hall to fight? Did they get attorneys? I mean, did they have any kind of legal recourse on their own to try to save their neighborhood?
Yeah, absolutely. But this was happening in the early 60s, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. Mm-hmm. So there were no black city council members. There were no black council, planning commissioners. There was very little political power within the black community. And at the time, and Johnny could speak to this more, there was still redlining. There were places where banks would not loan money to allow black families to buy houses and develop. So there was an effort to fight back, but the chips were stacked against them. And I think Brandi's reporting for the city council discussions at the time, or this was a done deal before the vote was taken. And Brandi, how many votes did they have to go to? How many meetings?
There were a lot of meetings that happened within that year that the city council ultimately decided to take the land. Mm-hmm. And not to have a slight detour, but I think the context of this particular time period is important because this was right after Newport News and Warwick merged. And there is also research that shows at the time that the black vote in Newport News before it merged with Warwick was almost approaching half. So they would have had almost equal amount of political power as whites at that time. But there's been research that shows that the underlying current behind that merger was to diminish. Was to diminish. Mm-hmm. And then this kind of set the stage for what happened in 1961 with the Shoe Lane community, because at that time, like Lou said, by that time, blacks didn't really have political power anymore because of what had happened years before.
So when they came in, eminent domain requires that you purchase the land. Yeah. Did they get fair market value for their homes?
No. Some of the families did get some. The Johnsons actually waited it out. Some families just took whatever money was offered to them. Mm-hmm. And actually, just to make it clear, they all rejected the initial offers because the first offers the city made were well below what the properties were worth. And they were based on some old records of property values that had been done decades before that, right? Mm-hmm. So they knew that, and so they pushed back, and the city went and it delayed the city taking the property. So as you can imagine, city council is also getting agitated because they're like, we're trying to take these properties, and they're saying no. So it forced them to go back and get a second and third appraisal. The second appraisal was much higher than the city council wanted, so they got another appraisal to get something which they felt like was worth them spending money on for these properties, and they went with that one instead. So they played this appraisal game until they got what they wanted. They wanted to pay for these properties.
So Lou, you talked about, you followed up with another story, and
Sure.
that focused on UVA and on Lambert, Old Dominion and Lambert's Point, which is right across the street from where we are right now.
Yes.
So what was that same story? What was going on in Lambert's Point, and how did ODU utilize this?
ODU is a very similar story to Christopher Newport. Lambert's Point was a working class black community. It was a stable place where black professionals and families could live, and Old Dominion needed a spot to put a college, and Lambert's Point was the place that they decided would be the place. Norfolk was really aggressive nationally when it came to urban renewal. They were some of the first and widest users of federal money to raise black neighborhoods and replace it with either public housing or highways, and the same thing came in with Lambert's Point. Doing research in the ODU archives, it was a steady approach to building and building and building more and pushing Lambert's Point out. And Lambert's Point residents fought that. And some point today, they are still fighting it, and they're fighting for recognition.
And Johnny, I know that you've done work mapping and so forth, particularly in the Lambert's Point community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So part of what I do as a geographer is I look at historical maps and I overlay them with data, census data going back, nearly a century, is all mappable. And in the case of Lambert's Point, I was actually just looking at these maps this morning. One of the old maps that you published, Lou, in your piece, when you put that into the mapping software and overlay that with data on race from 1960, which is the closest census year to when construction was happening. The map where they kind of drew in a magic marker the lines where they wanted to put the university or expand the university. When you overlay that with race from 1960, that is to a block the black part of Lambert's Point. Wow. And it is really and if I could zoom out from here a little bit, just to emphasize that in Norfolk, just about, if not every single racially integrated neighborhood in the mid-20th century, using urban renewal funds from the federal government, was bulldozed to build something new in its place. Old Dominion University, currently the campus of Sentara General Hospital and EVMS and CHKD, were racially integrated neighborhoods that were bulldozed. Broad Creek Village, I think, is the name of the area that's now mostly an industrial park, was an integrated neighborhood that was bulldozed to build an industrial park. The highways that they call the Spaghetti Bowl here, the 264 just north of the Berkeley Bridge, this was all an integrated neighborhood or primarily African-American neighborhood. And there's a great historian here in Norfolk, Hap White, who's done some work to show that, in this, sorry for giving a little history lesson here, but
because this is where, as I told you in the intro, you're going to give us the context.
This is all following the 1954 Brown versus Board decision and the massive resistance that was the backlash to that in the state of Virginia. And Norfolk's had a very clear and intentional strategy in raising integrated and black neighborhoods in order to create and maintain lines of residential segregation to then de facto perpetuate school segregation. So what happened at ODU is, in Lambert's Point, is kind of one piece of this broader puzzle that is Norfolk was particularly aggressive nationwide, but it's also something that played out all over the country.
And Lou, what about UVA?
UVA in some ways set a template and an early example of displacing black communities. They, after the Civil War, there was a small community of free black citizens, and it was right across the street from UVA grounds. The university leaders found it unsightly, so they built a performance hall to block it off, and then eventually they put new development in there that had racial covenants that said you can no longer sell this to a non-white person. It also happened in Vinegar Hill, which used to be a thriving black business community, which is now the downtown mall. Mm-hmm. So black families, as one university professor told me, as the university expands, the black population shrinks.
Wow. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about eminent domain, the expansion of higher education institutions, and what that all means in terms of African-American home ownership, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. And if you're just joining us, we are talking about the impact of racism and eminent domain on home ownership and generational wealth of Black people with investigative journalist Brandi Kellam and Lou Hansen with the Virginia Center of Investigative Journalism at WHRO, and the authors of Erasing the Black Spot, How a Virginia College Expanded by Uprooting a Black Neighborhood. We're also joined by Dr. Johnny Finn, Associate Professor of Geography and Chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. Let's talk to Vernon in Newport News. Hey, Vernon, how you doing?
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I was just calling to say that in that area, there were other people who moved in that became prominent developers themselves. A lot of ex-football players, professional football players specifically. Benny McRae used to live in that area. And he's the one that built what was first McRae Towers, then became New Hope Towers, which is down near the waterfront in Newport News. You can see it when you go across the Monitor Merrimack. Mm-hmm. And so, and even being a part of Warwick County, Main Street and North and South Avenue, that used to be Black farmland up to Warwick Boulevard back when the county was first annexed. So there's a lot of wealth. I mean, if anything justifies reparations, those specific instances of wealth being removed from people's possessions substantiates that, in my opinion.
Thank you, Vernon, for the call. We really appreciate that. So to that end, when Vernon talks about reparations, but let me ask a question before that. The universities that were the focus of your stories, what's been their reaction? And are they doing anything, or do they feel any responsibility to do anything about their role in the history of this? I'll start with you, Brandi.
Well, let me start with Christopher Newport, what they did in 2019, because that is also part of the undercurrent of our story about addressing this issue. So in 2019, they dedicated a plaque to William Walker, who has a legacy in the city as someone who was an entrepreneur. He was a developer. He was very influential, and he spoke up at the 1960s city council meetings to defend the community himself.
Black man?
Right? Black man, yes. He lived in the community, and at some point he became a member of the governing board of Christopher Newport University. So the sign that stands on his former house, where his house used to be, recognizes that he did fight in the 1960s, but he became a staunch supporter of the school and recognized its importance to the area and sort of helped the college essentially acquire the rest of the properties. And so you asked me earlier about the 5 homes that remain. Mm-hmm. For the 5 people that remain, they don't honestly feel like that represents the real fight of the community, because it did not end in the 1960s. You know, our reporting shows that there was a domino effect of the 1960s taking on future circumstances for this community, where they continue to feel threatened by this cloud of condemnation. So I say all of that to say that our story was in some ways addressing how the college has already addressed this issue. They have a plaque. And speaking to representatives of the college, you know, we have asked them about whether they what are their plans to do. And I know that at some point they're going to have a couple of events, and I'll let them give that information. Mm-hmm. So that is the extent that we know that the college has addressed this, that they plan on having conversations about it. I haven't heard anything about any other ways of addressing it. I know your caller asked about reparations. I haven't heard anything about that. And I haven't heard anything about even acknowledging the sign as a sort of pain point for the others that still live in the community today.
And is there any threat to those people that are still living in the community that the government could still come in and use eminent domain? Is eminent domain still around? Still legal?
Oh yes, the eminent domain is still
Absolutely.
legal.
Absolutely.
So I will say that in talking to the families, the ones that are there are planning to stay there as long as they can, right? But it may not. It's not necessarily really up to them. I mean, the school has been. It hasn't put any pressure on the families, but eminent domain is still a tool that they could use if they wanted to acquire the rest of the houses for whatever public use they would want to use it for. Okay. They haven't threatened the families, so I'll say that, to be fair. They have not directly or said anything to the families about leaving at this point. But if you're living under this cloud, you know that it's not necessarily your choice.
And are these houses in the boundaries of the university? So in other words, the university could expand into
yes, they are.
Area.
They're in the boundaries of the college.
Now, what about Old Dominion? What did they do in terms of Lambert's Point?
Old Dominion about 30 years ago recognized that they needed to have better relations with Lambert's Point residents. They established an office of community relations. And, a university that was largely white now has an enrollment of students of color of more than 40%, I believe it is. They have offered scholarships to members of the Lambert's Point community. They hold regular outreaches with them. But still, Lambert's Point residents and former residents feel like there's not enough recognition for the sacrifice that Lambert's Point families made. They lost their homes. They lost their community. And even those who remain, and there's a healthy community of Lambert's Point, know that it is not the same place that they grew up in. It is now, they share their block with students. They share it with, with a different atmosphere than the family-friendly that they wanted to. And University of Virginia has also started to look at its history, and current President Jim Ryan has said that all new development is going to include affordable housing. That's the goal for the university, and to open it up to all residents of Charlottesville, not simply members of the UVA community. So there's steps and recognition and some efforts underway.
So Old Dominion and Christopher Newport started out as extensions of the colleges of William and Mary.
Yes.
And I know William and Mary has done a lot of work on their own history, racial history, and all. But have they said anything about what happened with our two local Hampton Roads schools?
I'll say briefly, their official history says that Christopher Newport was built on donated land.
Oh,
Wow.
So it's just like that sign that I was referring to earlier, where it doesn't really address, it doesn't capture the full history or the fight of the residents who really remained and still remain today.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about eminent domain and higher education. Let's talk to, I think, Raphael. Do I have that correct?
Yes, you do. Thank you.
Hi.
I'm here. I was curious. See if the same thing applied with the facility in Portsmouth where Academy Park used to be, and now it's the home of PCC Portsmouth and the casino.
Is anybody familiar with that area?
I'm not familiar with that specific.
I'm not familiar with that either. I
think the caller is saying is if asking, I'm not sure how they acquired those.
Their land.
I know Academy Park was public housing, I believe, and the casino is there now, which was just recently built and opened recently. In terms of how they acquired those properties to build the casino, I believe they were already public. It was already public housing at that point.
Okay. According to our producer, our crack producer, Lisa Godley, because she grew up in that area, she said that Victory Boulevard separated the all-white Academy Park and the all-black Cavalier Manor, and TCC and the casino are located on the side where Academy Park was located. So Unfortunately, Raphael, we don't have a lot of information about Portsmouth, but we do know Norfolk and Newport News in this context. So I have a question for the two of you, Brandi and Lou. In just discussing your articles with various people who have read them and so forth. And I was speaking with someone who said to me, we checked with the normal people who would protest, and they're not saying anything. So this is a media-driven story, that this is not a story of any import because nobody's making a big fuss about it. I'm just curious about your reaction to that.
Well, we've gotten a lot of emails actually to that point that would actually contradict whatever that person is saying. I don't know who that person is, so
just a person,
right? Just a person. So we've gotten a lot of emails to the contrary that have thanked us for our reporting. I had one email where a reader told me that the way we laid out our facts actually is material that can be used to question and discuss intelligently the idea of reparations and systemic racism in this country that's obviously a prevalent national topic because of so many other communities where this has happened, right? I have not had, I'm actually surprised I've only heard like great things about our reporting. I actually expected to hear some pushback from readers, and we've gotten several dozens of emails. So this is not, I'm not saying this is one or two people that have emailed us thanking us for our story.
I think the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And, what attracted me to this story when Brandi, approached us was that I was a reporter at the Virginia Pilot for 15 years. I wrote about lots of different developments, lots of different new shiny things, showed up a lot of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings. And oftentimes we were able to tell a story of maybe a neighborhood that was being pushed out, but it got a little bit of publicity, but not enough. Brandi's story in getting deeply into Christopher Newport and Shoe Lane was a real example to look back at history and see what the real costs of these projects were. And they're sold at the time, and they do bring benefits to a community. But at the same time, we didn't look enough at what the costs to other communities were. And, when I think of a statistic that the National Association of Realtors gave me, white home buyers are more than twice as likely than black home buyers to use proceeds from another house sale in their home purchases. The generational wealth that has been missed, the opportunities that have been missed by older generations of black families is something that you can't ignore.
And the younger generations have no place to come back to now because the land is gone.
Right. And let me just add to that, because I think Lou was touching on something that could also explain why this story is important today, right? We did not, no one would have heard of Mr. Johnson or his collection or even known about the real history of this community had it not been for all the records and documents that he had. And really, it was just a knocking on a door. And that says a lot about the attention that the community got in terms of what happened versus what was already being said about the community and its contribution to the society by other institutions that have been controlling the narrative. So even if there's no outcry or protest, I think equally important is education and understanding and learning about what happens to this community from the community itself and not institutions controlling the narrative.
Because he decided that he was going to just document everything.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And overwhelmingly so. You would be moved by the amount of notebooks and photos. I mean, this
Have
Mr.
you met him, Johnny?
He has photos of over 100 houses that used to exist that no longer exist. That, to me, is the job of a reporter, is to document those things. And he's doing what reporters do every day on our jobs. And so essentially, it is a family and community driven story more than anything else because of what Mr. Johnson has collected.
Can I add something onto that, Barbara?
Absolutely.
Because this question about whether this is just a pure media story or if there's some importance to it. And I think we live in a city that we are continually building on top of things that have already been built. And we're about to build a whole lot more in terms of making the city and making the region more climate resilient. There's going to be an awful lot of infrastructure projects and an awful lot of people who are going to be put out of their homes and the communities that are going to be moved. And so the fact that this happened, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago doesn't mean that it's not also incredibly relevant to the present day. The quote, I use this all the time, James Baldwin in an interview in the 80s, I think, said that we carry our history with us. We are our history. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is in a really kind of literal way. We are always in the process of remaking the urban form that we simultaneously inhabit. Mm-hmm. And so to think that these questions of how do we make these decisions about where to build, these are not questions of only when we took farmland and residential areas and turned it into its next land use. These are questions that are happening right now, mm-hmm. Literally in city halls and in towns and in cities all over the country. These decisions are being made every single day. So I think it's really incredibly important.
And we had talked about language also, because cost analysis as opposed to erasing the black spot at this point. I mean, it really, hopefully people will pay attention. Jim Hansen is on the line. He is the Chief Communications Officer at Christopher Newport University. Hi, Jim. How are you?
Hi, Barbara. Thank you for the opportunity and for the informative program.
Oh, thank you. So you wanted to tell us about some things that are going to be happening on Christopher Newport's campus. I had asked our investigative journalists here what they had heard about ways that you all plan to address the history of what happened there.
Yes, thank you. We have 2 upcoming events, and we're hoping as many people as possible can join us on Wednesday, November 8th. We're holding a community conversation, and we're titling it What Happened on Shoe Lane and Why It Matters. The panelists include Dr. Finn, who is a guest on your program now, and mm-hmm. Dr. Phil Hamilton, a CNU historian who's written a lengthy history of the university. Cassandra Newby-Alexander from Norfolk State will be joining us. Mm-hmm. Pastor William Spencer from First Baptist Church Morrison, and Audrey Perry Williams, the president of the Hampton Roads Association for the study of African-American life and history. The moderator is Regina Brayboy. Now, she leads performance-centered consulting and Healthy Suffolk and is a senior fellow on human capital for the conference board, and we're fortunate to have Regina chair our President's Council on DEI. And so that should be a real interesting conversation for everyone from around the community to join us, and for our faculty and our staff and our students to learn more about the reporting that Brandi and Lou and the research that Dr. Finn and others have brought forth. Then on Monday, November 13th, CNU President Bill Kelly is leading a community walk, and we're beginning at the city's historic marker at Walker's Green. We're going to follow Shoe Lane over to Riverside Elementary School and then back to campus. And we've invited many Newport News city officials, legislators, school leaders, neighborhood leaders, as well as, of course, our faculty, staff, and students. And it's just an effort to sort of bridge the university and the neighborhood and expose as many people from the CNU community as possible to the people that live around us, and, of course, vice versa. All the details are on our calendar at cnu.edu. And, Barbara, we really do hope we can get good crowds and lots of community involvement at both events.
Okay, fantastic. If you will send us some information on that, we'll be sure to promote it again as we get a little bit closer to those dates. I'm curious, Jim, while I have you on the phone, what's been the reaction of the student body
to the coverage from Brandi and Lou? President Kelly sent a message to the students drawing their attention to it, and we're certainly hoping to engage with as many students as possible as we continue the conversation. Okay. All right. Thank you so very much for giving us a call. We appreciate it. Thank you, Barbara. All right. You take care. So have you guys heard from students, from others, who may have been reading? I did. I was in touch with a student who had told me that essentially most of the students had known something had happened, but they did not know the full aspect of what happened to this community until our reporting, and that students felt like there was something that should be done, but they weren't sure exactly what to do about it. So that's the reaction I've gotten, that most students have been shocked by some of the things that we shared in our reporting, especially the fact that
the taking in the 1960s wasn't the last time that this community experienced a loss based on actions taken by institutions such as city council and the college itself. So that was really shocking because everyone thought 1960s was it. But there were actually instances later on, up until recently, maybe about 10 years ago, where there were more houses there. We talk about 5 houses left, right? But the shocking thing to me was that there were way more houses there 10 years ago than now exist today, right? And that was actually one of the other reasons that drew me to the stories, because my question was, well, how could land be taken in the 1960s and everyone think the community was gone, but then there were at least 90 or so houses that were still bordering the campus until like the 1990s. No one knew the full story of how the rest of the houses came down, and the students I heard from were responding to that.
And so what did they do with those houses?
So essentially, there was a lawsuit in the late 1980s where this was when the community found out that the college did expand its boundaries. Because if you recall, in the 1960s, it was just the center part of the community. And then there were Black people who were still living around the outskirts, and some even moved in after that thinking, oh, everything's over with. We'll just take whatever's left and build our homes. But then in the late 1980s, they found out that through the newspaper that the college had expanded its boundaries to include the rest of their houses on the boundaries. And that's what sparked this lawsuit, which it never went to trial because it was dismissed before trial, but it was in federal court. And ultimately it was dismissed to the detriment of the remaining homeowners, who recognized that they were now within the boundaries of the college. And they knew essentially, like, the writing on the wall is our house is not going to be here forever. So there were some eminent domain pressures. We don't have the proof that there was actually land taken by eminent domain, but we've seen documents that show that there was action to do that at some point by the college for the remaining houses. But I think everyone just said, well, if we're going to be pressured to sell, we might as well just get whatever money we can get. Exactly.
Yeah. And so, which, I've heard some people say too, well, people sold their land, so.
Right. As if it was like, oh, well, you know what, let's just sell. Right. We'll be happy somewhere else. But evidence shows that if there are still 5 houses there, obviously people did not want to leave that community because they felt that it was an important area for them to, like, if you think about back in the 1960s, when you had a Black community, that was your means of survival, right?
Literally.
And these were families that were marrying into each other. So they were literally keeping it within the family, within that core area of the community at the time. And the disruption caused a lot of things to fall apart. And ultimately, we see what we see today, but you still see 5 houses there because they're still holding on.
Yes. Johnny, when you teach on the campus, you've got students there, as they're looking at careers in urban planning and in geography and all. I mean, what's their reaction to hearing the history and also understanding that in a different way it's still happening?
Yeah, well, I'm actually currently teaching a course on urban geography. I think technically my class just ended about 25 minutes ago. Forgive me, my students, for not being there today. But the timing of this article, for my selfish purposes, couldn't have been better because it dropped right when I was in my class teaching on the history of urban renewal in the United States. Oh, wow. And I had somebody texted your article as soon as it posted to ProPublica and texted it to me. And I was able to assign it that same day to my students and kind of fit it right into the syllabus. And I think what Brandi, what you said is true to my experience. The students have a sense of what had happened. They wonder about, like, these are 5 houses that they walk by every day. They see them, and it's kind of a peculiar thing on a university campus that's so kind of manicured and the landscape is the forms have really been kind of envisioned in a particular way. And to have these kind of seemingly, and I say the word seemingly, random houses kind of tucked in, and it's almost curiosity for the students. And I think this article is so important for the students to see how they themselves and the institution to which they are, to which they belong, at least for a few years of their young adulthood, are implicated in this story. And my students found it really, I think, very interesting and really important. I don't have the sense that they felt like it was a kind of a personal attack in any way. I think they were really interested in learning about this history, and seeing how they, like I said, how they themselves and the institution that they belong to are implicated in the story.
So I know you guys are working on a documentary about this.
Yes.
And you have something coming up tonight.
We do. We have a live event at Hampton University at 6 p.m. tonight, and it's going to be a panel discussion, and you can hear more of Brandi and myself, along with an eminent domain attorney, Josh Baker, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
We love Cassandra.
So we're really happy to have the experts cover the whole scope of what happens to a community and get into the history and get into the powers of eminent domain and how it's still being used in various communities. You know, Johnny mentioned it a little bit earlier. There are going to be massive redevelopment projects. Norfolk is going to have a $2.6 billion seawall project. There's going to be winners. There's going to be losers. The things that happened in the 60s are happening today in 2023. So tonight, 6 p.m. at Hampton University, panel discussion live. Ask us questions, please. Show up.
You know, and Nancy Rogan, who handles community engagement here, says that it is sold out for tonight. So I guess you got to have a big crowd. Wow. That is awesome. Yeah. Brandi, in the last 2 minutes that we have, how are the Johnsons and what has this story done for them?
Wow. So I wish I had more than 2 minutes, but I, let's see, because they're just such phenomenal people. You could talk about them for hours, right? But they're great. They have read the story and they feel, Mr. Johnson, I think himself feels like his work wasn't done in vain, right? That everything he collected and documented, even though he didn't do it for this purpose, that it's not going to be lost with him, that it will live on beyond him. And they've really been very happy with the response they've gotten to the story. I think they told me that someone anonymously dropped flowers on their front porch.
Oh, you're going to make me cry.
I know. And it told them to keep up the fight. And that really touched me. It touched them, but it touched me too. Because it just goes to show that these are the type of stories that people do want to hear. They want to know about the history. They want to know what happened in these communities. And so the Johnsons feel like they have contributed something to society that can be beneficial.
Brandi, Kellam, and Lou Hansen, and Johnny Finn, Dr. Johnny Finn, thank you guys so much. This has been an incredible hour of history that we needed to know and to understand. And so I'm so glad that you guys were able to come on and to talk with us about it. Thank you. Before we go, audience, I do want to say one thing. I do want to thank the Virginia Organization for Inclusive Concepts and Equitable Solutions, or better known as Voices. And they are a think tank of diversity, equity, and inclusion subject matter experts focused on best practices and the in-depth consideration of fair and equal treatment, systemic and institutional racism, socioeconomic issues, and social determinants of health that are barriers to quality of life for historically marginalized and underserved people. They gave Another View and me an award this week for our work with Community Access and Equity Award in Media for the work that we do in telling our story. So I just want to say publicly, thank you.
Well deserved.
Congratulations.
Just wanted to say, to them, thank you so much for recognizing the work that we do. We are truly just trying to get people, all of us, to learn to know each other and to understand each other better. And thank you so much for listening for this hour. Please share this show with someone that you know. Simply go to anotherviewradio.org and download the podcast. On our site, you will find all of our archive shows and the chance to sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Next week on Another View, it's Another View on Health with cardiologist Dr. Keith Newby. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Jordan Christie is our audio engineer. And happy birthday, Jordan. We know it's this weekend. Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Thanks so much for listening. And let's get together again next Thursday at noon for another view.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever, whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.